Ladies and gentlemen, the days of Noah, Noah 2.0 has begun. We are living in the beginning of a repeat of the days of Noah. Whether or not you believe that that's what Jesus meant when he said, as in the days of Noah, is irrelevant. It makes no difference. But there will be one last insurrection to try and usurp that throne. And that is literally, we are entering into the final stages of that insurrection. And it will not be a mere insurrection of human beings. This is the final insurrection of the enemies of the King of Kings. Descended in the days of Jared, in the world before the flood of Noah, and copulated with human women, and basically, in a nutshell, created a genetic mess, genetic chaos on the earth, which was one of the primary factors that led to the flood of Noah. And so we have been going around the world researching, investigating, visiting key places, key locations on the earth that are relevant to the Genesis 6 narrative, or at least might be relevant to the Genesis 6 narrative, both in terms of its prehistoric implications and its prophetic implications. And so we began in some of the what we consider to be some of the most relevant locations, relevant in a number of ways. We began in Peru and Bolivia because I spent 10 years of my life living in Peru and the Amazon region in South America. And so I was familiar with the culture. I speak the language, which is Spanish. I know my way around Peru, and I have lots of contacts in Peru, so that it made sense for us to begin there, but also because Peru has some of the most impressive megaliths on the planet. And we believe that megaliths are remnants from a pre-flood age, are the remnants of the civilization that existed in the world before the flood of Noah, and are some of the best examples that we can touch, that we can document, that we can talk about and feature in a film representing the time before the flood of Noah, and the technology, hinting at the technology that might have existed in the time before the flood of Noah, and not just the technology, but also the entities that existed in the world before the flood of Noah. So that's why we started in Peru in episode 1, and Bolivia. We went to Tiwanaku, Pumapunku. In episode 2, episode 1 was a to be continued. Episode 2, we pick up where episode 1 left off, but now we go to Rome, we go to the island of Malta, and we're in some different locations in Peru, specifically in the Cusco region. And basically what we discover is that the Catholic Church, specifically the Holy See, is right at the center of the cover-up concerning the pre-flood world and the entities that inhabited it.
Right. It's the cover-up, right? It's the main thing that it seems like the Catholic system has been working very hard to cover for generations. And this, I think people don't realize the scope of history that's been covered up, to where, everything that we have been taught in terms of some of the, like the entities that have been covered up, giants, the bones, everything else that you guys have investigated to show that there was something going on in the past that is completely wiped out of history books and history classrooms. And, it makes people question, like, wait a minute, and then, what's really happening? But, it's almost too late to even dig into some of the stuff happening before, because the stuff happening now, the stuff being uncovered, the veil's being taken off. Like, these things are being exposed. You guys are part of that, of doing that, in the spirit of Ephesians 5:11. And, I find it fascinating because you can see the ripple effect of something like that throughout everything we talk about. All the talk about the Illuminati, the New World Order, all these topics that are really popular now, they stem from these cover-ups, these central themes that are biblical themes. And this is why I keep telling people, even if you're an atheist, even if you're a complete skeptic, this affects you. The biblical narrative affects you. You're part of this storyline, whether you like it or not. And so you better at least know what's happening, or at least investigate these issues. It's just a fair sort of, offer for people to look into these things. But, the cover-up is so deep. But I found something interesting about these mountains, these mounds, and these pyramids, basically, that you're uncovering as part of your investigation in these films. There's something in human nature that feels a sense of accomplishment, achievement and things like that when we reach the top of a mountain, right? There's a metaphorical thing there, but there's also a physical, hey, I did it, reached the top of a mountain. And in conjunction with that, to the pyramid, the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid, in this idea of, trying to conquer, trying to rule, in relationship with, everything we see, the back of the dollar bill, all that stuff, tying into the occult, then tying into the UN and all that stuff. Everything's connected. What have you found about these mountains or mounds that you think were potentially, ancient structures, ancient pyramids? What is it about them that you found fascinating, or how did you even come to that conclusion?
Well, specifically, if you're going to talk about mounds, we actually deal with the mounds and the mound builders. We're going to deal with the mounds and the mound builders in the next episode, which is episode 3, which is actually under production right now. And there's some really exciting stuff going on concerning episode 3. Tom Horn is now on the ground level of the True Legend series. He's joined the True Legend series and is a central part of episode 3, and has a lot of information to add concerning the mounds and the mound builders and the Native Americans in Sardinia. When we were in Sardinia, I went to Sardinia twice with our production team, with our camera crew, and Sardinia is, and for those who don't know where Sardinia is located, it's located off the coast of Rome. Not far off the coast of Rome, right above, it's the island there, basically between Rome and France. In fact, Sardinia is the lower island, the larger island, and above Sardinia is Corsica, which belongs to France, the birthplace of Napoleon. And Sardinia is fascinating because it is very much very analogous to the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when the mounds were still present all over the United States, from the mound building cultures, which we believe in some cases were giants. And there's a correlation between the situation that was happening here in the United States in the late 19th century and the island of Sardinia. And the the situation is very, very similar. Sardinia, just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maximum 40 years ago, was in a situation in which they were digging the foundations for many of their roads and modernizing their society there on the island of Sardinia, especially in some of the villages. And these are old Italian villages, and so they were digging down to build foundations for buildings. And what was happening was the bones of giants were being discovered time and time again all over the island of Sardinia. And so, and again, these giants were also mound builders in Sardinia, and it was the same kind of situation, as I said, that was happening in the late 19th century here in the United States, and it was showing up in the newspapers. It was a local phenomenon that these bones of giants were being discovered, not just bones, bodies, in some cases mummified bodies, 15 feet plus. And these entities, these bodies, were adorned in gold and silver and precious jewels. So we're not talking about mastodons or giant sloths. We're talking about giants that were wearing rings and necklaces and bracelets. In fact, it was becoming so common that when a body of a giant would be discovered in Sardinia by a farmer or by a construction worker, the first thing they would do is look for jewelry on the fingers and around the neck and on the wrist, because these giants were associated with vast hoards of treasure and gold. And so
they were probably worshipped, right, as gods, and that's why they.
I'm sure they were. Yeah. I'm sure they were in some cases, and we're dealing with both pre-flood, the remains of pre-flood entities and post-flood entities. The post-flood entities are always smaller and are more associated with, obviously, post-flood cultures, like the Egyptians, who we found evidence in Sardinia that the ancient Egyptians were hiring the Sardinian giant races, basically as mercenaries and builders. And you'll find that this is a common thread throughout post-flood history, is that the mound builders and the giants, and in some cases when we say giants, we're talking about 7 foot to 9 foot tall giants. So we're talking about some of these giants are like NBA basketball players, but with genetic deviations. We're talking about very, very strong, robust entities that are not fully human, as opposed to just tall human beings. But then sometimes you're also dealing with giants ranging from the 9 to the 12 foot tall region, or from the 10 to the 12 foot tall region, and then in some cases you're finding 12 to 15. And of course, 15 plus, which is much rarer accounts of 15 plus foot giants. Sometimes these giants have elongated skulls. Sometimes they have red hair. Sometimes they have 6 fingers and 6 toes. And one thing I can guarantee you is that they absolutely existed. This race of giants, this race of hybrid, non-human entities of very unusual stature and strength, and again, who were very robust in terms of their skeletal structure. And so again, this is a worldwide phenomenon, but especially as it relates to the United States and the mound builders, there is a direct correlation with Sardinia, and that will be part of the content. We will feature that content in episode 3.
Right. And before we go in, back in towards sort of the pyramid structures and stuff, the question that I really have in terms of the giants and the different kinds of giants you found, were they just kind of like a descendant that ended with these guys, or do you think they passed on their genetics somewhere?
Are we talking post-flood giants?
Post-flood, yeah. So
because there's a divide between pre-flood giants and post-flood giants. We know that the Bible says in Genesis chapter 6 that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. And we know that the also after that includes the post-flood time, the post-flood ages, because we find giants occurring not only in the biblical narrative, but also in the narratives of many other cultures. Every primary civilization on Earth has a giant mythos, and also a mythos of the flood and of the gods that descended. And many of these cultures, such as the Inca, and some of the native cultures that were subdued by the Inca, knew that the giants that existed in the world before the flood of Noah, or before the Great Flood, they wouldn't call it the flood of Noah, before the Great Flood, were of greater stature, were taller, were bigger, were more monstrous than the giants that appeared in the world after the flood. So this was a ubiquitous knowledge all over the earth, that there were giants in the world before the flood, and there were giants in the world after the flood, and the giants that came after the flood were of a lesser stock than those that existed in the world before the flood. This again it occurs in the mythos of every primary, specifically that there were giants in the earth, occurs in the mythos of every primary culture on earth. In the case of Peru specifically, we document in episode 1 of our True Legends documentary series called Technology of the Fallen, we document and we show documentation coming from the 16th century that the bones of giants were uncovered and confiscated in Peru during the conquest of the Incan Empire. Now, if you accept the narrative of the chroniclers who recorded the history of the conquest of Peru, which is the accepted historical account that we find in our history books today, these same chroniclers, these same historians are telling us in the same documents from which we derive the history of the conquest of Peru, that the bones of giants were discovered. Not only the bones of giants, because we have a lot of detractors and critics who will say they were mistaking the bones. The chroniclers, these were uneducated people. They were mistaking these bones for the bones of mastodons and giant sloths and dinosaurs and so forth. The problem is that we have records, again, from the same guys that were recording the conquest, were writing history concerning the conquest, Pizarro and the 200 or so conquistadors who decimated the Incan Empire. These same guys recorded that in some cases, the mummified bodies of giants dressed in cumbia, dressed in traditional native ceremonial clothes, were discovered. In one particular instance, the bodies of giants were discovered in a cave. They were dressed in cumbia, and they were being worshipped as the progenitors of those people, of the natives. And these giants were very, very large. They were said to be 3 times the size of human beings of normal stature. So even if the Indians were only 5 foot tall, you're still dealing with 15-foot giants. And they had elongated skulls, deformed. They described them as having deformed skulls, which I think that we can safely assume that we're dealing with elongated skulls, and that's why the natives were in many cases engaging in cranial deformation with headboarding to emulate the gods, to emulate the shape of the heads of the gods who they were worshiping as their progenitors, not because they had these fairy tales concerning these giants, but because they had the bodies, the remains of these giants, the entire mummified bodies of these giants enshrined in a cave, dressed in cumbia, ceremonial cloth. And it was apparent to the chroniclers, by the way, it was the royal inspectors, the visitadores they were called. They were working for the Kingdom of Spain in conjunction with the Roman Catholic Church, agents of the Roman Catholic Church, with the chroniclers and the monks and the priests from the different orders of the Catholic Church. So you had the on one hand you had the visitadores, the royal inspectors from Spain, and you had the agents of Rome, who were also many of them Spanish, but they were working, of course, for the Holy See. Right. Both of these groups together were chronicling these encounters with the natives as they were laboring to extirpate idolatry among the natives. In other words, they were there to exterminate the idolatrous practices of the natives and to force the natives to submit to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. While they were engaged in this activity, they were burning all of the idols that the natives had. So understand, they're going through Peru. Again, the royal inspectors from Spain, together with the agents of Rome, the Catholic Church, are going through the regions of Peru, which at that time, Peru also occupied Ecuador and Bolivia, the Incan Empire. And they're finding whatever artifacts the natives are worshiping, and they are burning them, along with many of the priests among the natives, the pagan priests. I mean, they're burning these priests along with their artifacts, and they're committing atrocities in the spirit of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was alive and well. The Jesuits came not long after the conquistadors to continue the dastardly work of the Inquisition, the bloodthirsty activities of those inquisitors. And as they're destroying the idols, as they're destroying the artifacts of the pagan religions of these natives, they're finding that the natives are actually worshiping the mummified bodies of gigantic humanoids. Okay, so again, I went through that detailed explanation so that people will understand that what I just told you literally comes from the exact same documents, historical documents from the library, the Congressional Library in Peru, from the same documents that you get your history of the conquest of Peru, of the Incan Empire, that you read in your history books in first grade and all the way up through high school and even into the university level. By the way, for those who are interested in fact-checking what I just said, you can look up you're going to have to be able to read Spanish, but some of these chroniclers and historians include Bernabé Cobo, Antonio de la Calancha, and guys like César de Leon. So these accounts are in the historical documents, but have been omitted for one reason or another in the official historical accounts of the conquest of Peru. So for those who want to do some more digging, Agustín de Zárate, and there's a host of chroniclers, about 6, maybe even 7, who mention the bones of giants and giants. But to your question, I found it very enlightening when I discovered in the historical accounts from Peru that some of these giants were being described as having deformed heads. And the way that the text is written in the account, it really could read a couple of different ways. But the sense that you get is that they're describing very large, abnormally large heads, which I believe is a direct reference to elongated skulls. And I find it interesting that the natives referred to these giants, again, whom they were worshiping, as their progenitors. And so they had deified this race of giants and saw themselves as the offspring of this divine race. Right. And so now we can talk about elongated skulls and the elongated skull phenomenon, especially as it pertains to Peru and Paracas. L.A. Marsuli is doing a lot of work with the elongated skulls phenomenon, along with Brian Forster in Peru. specifically in the Cusco region, and in the region of it slipped my mind, Paracas, Peru, which is near the coast, and which is a very arid region. So you have a lot of mummies that are discovered there near the Atacama Desert. Actually, the Atacama Desert is more to the south, where there are actually a lot of elongated skulls discovered as well. In fact, one of the most ridiculous elongated skulls I've ever seen, and it's in our film, The Unholy Sea, the second edition of our documentary film series, was discovered in the Atacama Desert, which is, of course, where the Atacama humanoid came out of, was discovered also, the little creature that was featured in the documentary series. So there's some and the reason why there's so many discoveries in the Atacama Desert, bizarre discoveries in terms of mummified remains of humans and these weird entities, is precisely because it is so arid. It really doesn't get any rainfall at all. So the preservation is extreme. And so, again, I saw one of the most freakish elongated skulls I've ever seen. And anybody who claims that this particular image was the result of headboarding has to deal with some very practical problems, such as when you shape the human skull, which you can. Everybody knows that when a baby's born, their skull is very soft. In fact, their cranium is very soft. In fact, if you have a baby that spends too much time on their back, the baby will develop a flat head. Or on their side, one particular side, that baby will develop, that side of their head will be disproportionately flat compared to the other side. Right. So the idea of shaping the skull, it's a practice that happens. It's ubiquitous all over the earth in a lot of different cultures because it is so easy to do at the infant level. I mean, you can shape the cranium in very bizarre ways, even very pointed cones. But what you cannot do is you cannot add additional mass to the cranium, and you cannot create additional cranial capacity inside of the cranium. In other words, you're not going to make the brains any bigger, and you're not going to increase the size of the brain cavity, which is exactly what we find with many of these elongated skulls. Not all of them. Many of them are the result of cranial deformation and headboarding. But some of them, I am absolutely convinced, for a number of reasons, that at least some of them are not the result of cranial deformation, but are in fact the result of genetic deviation. In other words, there's something genetically unusual. Let's say that there's something unusual in the genome of these particular entities. And let me make 2 points about this while I'm thinking about it. Number one, to answer your question more poignantly, yes, I do believe that there are some of the genetic components from the giants and from the hybrids that made it to the other side of the flood do exist today, and I believe are evident in some of the remains of these elongated skull creatures, these elongated skull humanoids, to a degree. The second point I want to make is this. Just because you get genetic testing done on a skeleton with an elongated skull and a cranium that is displaying a very acute elongated skull, just because that genetic testing reveals that the subject, the specimen in question, is human or mainly human, does not mean that there are not genes present in that genome that are unusual.
Right.
Because many times they cannot sequence the entirety of the genome. And those genetic components, those genes, could be embedded anywhere in that genome. they would have to specifically find exactly where that genetic aberration is located. You cannot just get 90% of the genome sequenced and say, oh, there's nothing unusual here. There's obviously something unusual because of the phenotype is expressing the genotype. In other words, there is a physical manifestation of a genetic alteration.
Right.
And
somewhere the code
somewhere there is a snippet of DNA inside of the entirety of that genome embedded somewhere, and it could be small. It could be a very small snippet of DNA that is existent inside of that genome that is causing the phenotypic distinction. In other words, the physical manifestation of an elongated skull that is not only elongated, but also displays some features that are very unusual when juxtaposed with regular human anatomy.
Right.
And so I think that there's a lot of intellectuals out there who are trying to sound smarter than guys like L.A. Marzulli, who are doing these who are getting this genetic testing done on these specimens, elongated skull specimens, and they're sitting back saying, this isn't genetic. It's ridiculous to think this is genetic. This is just cradle headboarding. This is just cranial deformation. Even when you do get the genetic testing, it's going to show that it's human or that it's primarily human, blah, blah, blah. But they're discounting the fact that it only takes a very small amount of deviant genetic information to be present in the genome, depending on where it is in the genome, not just how much information is there. The genome is so complex. It also depends on where specifically that snippet, that gene is located in the totality of that genome, which is very large and very complex, that can give you the manifestation of an elongated skull. So we need to think in complex terms when we look at, when we think about giants, when we think about the genes of giants. You could have, there could be individuals walking around the earth at this time who are alive, who have, let's just call them Nephilim components, still latent in their genomes that are unactivated, but are present. Latent Nephilim genes that are present, that are residues of prominent Nephilim races.
Yeah, it seems like those that were prominent were explicitly wiped out by God. And that's part of the bigger narrative that's never discussed in the churches with the Bible in the Old Testament, is God going after those giant tribes. But that complexity you bring up is so important for people to grasp, because, if you really think about genetics and DNA and what we understand about it, our DNA changes with, what we eat, how we consume things, like, all the GMO stuff we're bombarded with, it's changing us at a genetic level. I mean, there's no question that kind of stuff is happening. So, and then you look at even biblically, Nimrod became a Gibborim. And, that whole concept of something changed in Nimrod, it doesn't always have to be a mating process. And I think people get stuck on that. Like, oh, how could they have how could they pass down the genetics? Well, I mean, look, today in laboratories, we're doing it. CRISPR technology has allowed any DNA biotechnician or whatever to go in there and start manipulating DNA. So that's already happening in labs today. Who knows what kind of technology was being accessed or has been accessed throughout the centuries. And, I would say that, and I think you'd agree with me to some extent, is in the antediluvian world, this sort of stuff was almost, common ground, probably at a much more raw kind of process, not so much laboratory settings in the way we, think of it. What are your thoughts on that in terms of that ancient technology being much more in line with nature than we expect?
Well, we have to understand what we're dealing with, who we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Benai Elohim,
Right.
the sons of God in the Old Testament, who shouted for joy when the earth was created. They were there when the rudimentary constituents of matter were being assembled.
Right.
They understand physics better than any human being could ever possibly hope to understand physics. They understand genetics. And when I say they, I mean the Benai Elohim, the sons of God, these angelic entities, including the Watchers, which may in fact be a description of occupation rather than actually defining a certain kind of angelic creature. In other words, the Watchers could be all kinds of different things that are occupying a very specific task.
It's a job description rather than...
In other words, it's a job description, right? So these entities are vastly superior in terms of intelligence to the human race, and I can say that definitively because the Bible says that we were created to be a little lower than the angels. And understand that when it says that we were created to be a little lower than the angels, it's referring to our progenitor, Adam, was created to be a little lower than the angels. And Adam was much more of a human. Let's just say, let's put it very simply. Adam was more human than you and I.
He was the purest human.
He was the prototypical human. He was the first. He had no genetic defect in the beginning until sin and death entered in. He was Superman in every sense of the word. I mean, in every sense of the description of what that means. In other words, he was the apex of our race. He was smarter than we are. He was stronger than we are. He certainly lived way longer than we do. His eyesight was probably unimaginable. His hearing, he probably was able to discern and to see and to hear things that we can no longer discern and see and hear. His mental capacity was off the charts in comparison to ours. Is it possible that he could have communicated telepathically with Eve and with other entities? I don't see why not. The brain is an amazing tool created by God, given to our species specifically. It is an absolute, we're just beginning to understand the basic operations of the brain. So when the Bible says that Adam was created a little lower than that we were created a little lower than the angels, you have to think of Adam, the apex of our species. And yet, he was still a little lower than the entities in the category above him. So even when dealing with the apex of our species, these entities that we glibly call angels were superior to the human race. So when you look at the Genesis 6 narrative, the Watchers event, you have to understand that you're dealing with the Benai Elohim, who were there, again, when the constituents of matter were forming, and the genetic code of the human race and of all life on Earth. These guys understand science. We are observing science. Even the best of our scientists, the most haughty and elevated of our scientific minds, even throughout history, take the best scientific minds, take your Stephen Hawkins and your Einsteins, and their knowledge is nothing compared to the lowliest angel. They are observing to the best of their ability in terms of our scientists. They are making simplistic observations about the natural order. These entities who we're referring to, the Benai Elohim, were watching the laws of physics and the laws of nature begin. They saw the mechanism get set into motion from the very beginning. So the reason why I point that out is we have to have that kind of an understanding when looking back into the pre-flood world and dealing with the Watchers. these guys knew how to manipulate both physics, genetics, any kind of science that you want to name. These guys were far more brilliant than any of us could ever hope to be. So it's plausible and it's likely that when we talk about producing offspring, that it wasn't just a rude sexual encounter. I'm sure that that was happening also, because if you read the book of Enoch, you're going to find out that there is a lust component involved. So yes, they were lusting after the daughters of men. There was a component of sensuality involved in what happened with the Watchers.
Right.
So on a very base level, they wanted to copulate with human women, but we have to understand that there is also something scientific, some advanced knowledge that was involved in the tampering on the genetic level that was occurring in those times, not only with the human race, but also with beasts. They were also copulating and playing with the genetic structure of animal life on Earth as well, if you give any credence to the other scrolls that were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the Book of Giants.
Right. Yeah. And you know, the special knowledge, or the the forbidden knowledge, I think, is the way some translations of the Book of Enoch have it. It explicitly says that the Watchers gave humankind that knowledge that they shouldn't have had, and that was part of, you know, their punishment is that they crossed the barriers, the lines of division that God had created, the barriers between maybe species, if you want to call it that, between these angelic beings and humans, especially after the fall. You know, I think something was separated there with realities, I think, that either, you know, dimensionally or whatever, and I think it ties into what you were saying, that the extra perceptions, and sort of the more supernatural, the telekinetic abilities and stuff that are latent, I think, in human beings. There's actually been scientific evidence to prove that we have, that all humans have this psi level, you know, where the body, there was a visual test. Chris Putnam talked about it. I mentioned it in a video, a couple of videos ago, where they did experiments, and it's been verified, you know, a couple times over, where people, you know, they have a response, a physiological response to images before the images are shown. And it's consistent, you know,
that's right,
erotic images or whatever. That experiment, it really does show that the human being has this intuitive nature in relationship to creation that is quite profound. And
we've all experienced it.
Yeah,
all of us have
absolutely.
experienced deja vu. All of us have experienced having a feeling that you know something before it's told to you. You get a gut feeling. We refer to it as a feeling in our gut. And then you find out that exactly what you were, the premonition you were feeling happened to be true. So there's obviously sensory faculties connected to this equipment,
right,
the human form. Faculties that are directly related to our genotypic makeup, and that are, as you said, latent. And I've been saying on the radio on numerous occasions that I believe that part of the reason why they're latent in human beings, why they're deactivated, there's a twofold reason in my mind. Number one, because we have greatly devolved from Adam. Yeah. We are, in fact, evolving. I don't believe in evolution. I certainly believe in devolution. We are devolving. Yeah. We are devolving and are in a state of decay, genetically speaking, and that has been proven.
Right.
Unequivocally. We are not gaining, our genomes are not gaining information, they are losing information. We are atrophying, genetically speaking. So that's one fact, and one factor that contributes to this idea that there are latent mechanisms, latent abilities within the human genome. The second thing is, I believe that God himself has created a dampering effect,
Yeah.
has built in a firewall for our protection.
Yeah.
Because if we are going to be, there are things that if we were exposed to, continually exposed to, concerning the nature of reality, our equipment is, we can't use our equipment the way that we used to be able to use it, so we can no longer process reality.
Right.
On the same level. And what it would lead to is, if we were still exposed to all of this, let's just call it, for the sake of argument, extra-dimensional reality around us, without the ability to rightly process it, it would lead to madness.
Right. That's what
in the human psyche.
Yeah, and that's why I think people with schizophrenia, people with all these different disorders, not just schizophrenia, but any kind of experience, people seek it with drugs. The ayahuasca thing is big. It's a reality. People just don't like to admit it. But yeah, I agree, man. There's definitely something there. Now,
and there's a cost. There's a cost for those who reactivate through illicit means, because there are. I lived in the Amazon, and the witch doctor culture that exists in the Amazon. On one level, it's kind of a joke to modern minds. You picture these primitive, uneducated men dancing around in skirts and masks, and blowing cigarette smoke in people's face and so forth. Right. And it is primitive and it is ignorant, but it's also very real, because some of these individuals, not all of them, most of them are plagiarizers and performers and posers, but some of them have made contact with demonic entities that have enabled them to reactivate some of those latent things in their genetic makeup, in the physical equipment that we have as human beings, in our brains, and in the other faculties that we have in our anatomy. And many of these guys are actually also empowered by entities to do things that defy what we would consider the limits of the natural world and the limits of physics. These guys can do some very, very scary things. I saw, and I've said this on numerous occasions, I have seen. Let me bring up a couple of things here. I have seen, first and foremost, the most terrifying, one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in my life, regarding the repercussions of messing with these witch doctors, was a woman. I went to see this woman with a pastor friend of mine named Benny Humphreys in Tarapoto, Peru. And Benny took me to visit this woman who had recently visited a witch doctor. And the witch doctors will often, again, many of them are posers. Many of them are it's just an industry. Right. Some of them are the real deal, tapped into really nasty spirits that are controlling them and using them, and with whom they have intercourse. And this woman went to visit this witch doctor to put a hex on another individual. So from the beginning, you're dealing with a very sinful heart, somebody who has a grudge against somebody else, who wants to do them harm. Right. This woman visited this witch doctor with the intent to do harm to someone else. Oftentimes, these witch doctors will tell you have to go and acquire a personal possession of this person. Sometimes an article of clothing, sometimes a picture, something that they're in possession of, that belongs to them. And you bring it to the witch doctor, and they perform a ceremonial hex on this person or on their family. And very dark and sinister things oftentimes occur in the aftermath. Sometimes it backfires, and the dark and sinister things happen to either the witch doctor or to the person that is acquiring the service of the witch doctor. And in this case, it was this woman, because I think it was in a very short period of time after she went to put a hex on somebody, that all of the bones in her body fused together.
Man.
And it was a terrible sight to behold. Here was a woman lying in bed, skinny, dying, in absolute agony, trapped in the prison of her body. All she could do was moan, and her bones were fused together. She could no longer move her body. Her bones were stiff and fused together. Now, is there some kind of medical explanation that would dispel the notion that it had anything to do with the witch doctor or some kind of a demonic phenomenon? Possibly.
Well,
But I'll tell you what,
they can
when
probably explain the mechanics of it, but not.
when I was standing in front of this woman, I can tell you, for whatever it's worth, that there is something very dark and demonic in that room with this woman, and it happened. I think it might have happened the day after. So was it a coincidence? You may draw the conclusion, not you personally, but some of your listeners may draw the conclusion that it was pure coincidence. Fine. But I've seen it too many times for me to discount the possibility of a demonic repercussion from this kind of activity. I've seen all kinds of crazy things that have demonstrated to me unequivocally that there are a few different things happening in terms of metaphysics regarding people who attempt to tap into these latent, whether they be the latent abilities that are present in the human genome, or acquiring the empowerment or beseeching the empowerment of extra-dimensional entities, or are in fact possessed by these hybrid spirits, the unclean spirits. Right. I've seen cases which could probably fit one of those, numerous cases that could certainly fit one of those categories. And it's a very real phenomenon when you expose yourself to what people call, some people call them gateway drugs, not in the sense that these drugs are gateways to worse drugs, but in the sense that these drugs are gateways to entities that come and take up residence in your life, whether it be in a possessing mode, or whether it be just they now have authority to interact with you in a way that they did not before, right, because you gave them that authority. You opened the door, you invited them to interact with you, and they will empower you. They will do things for you, but at a cost. Mm-hmm. There's always something that they want from you. Mm-hmm. And it's always very costly. And in one case, it's been described to me on numerous occasions, the activity that happens when individuals engage in an ayahuasca ceremony in the jungles of South America. Ayahuasca is very popular. Sometimes it's an innocuous thing where a group of guys will get together, take ayahuasca, and just end up puking their brains out. Right. All night. But other times, if you have a true practitioner of the occult conducting the ayahuasca ceremony, they will actually call and beseech and beckon certain entities to come and to participate and to take up residence in the lives of those who are participating in the ayahuasca ceremony. It's been described to me on a couple of occasions that there are certain ceremonies in which, and this is the most common ceremony, ritual related to ayahuasca if you're dealing with a true occult practitioner, in other words, a true witch doctor. In the Amazon, is they'll have a group of people sit in a circle, they'll go through this ritual involving smoke, involving a certain kind of music and chanting and dancing, and the participants will take the ayahuasca with a very particular mix of ayahuasca, and then these witch doctors summon entities to come into the center of the circle by name, and these entities come and they will go from person to person and they will choose who they will either inhabit or who they will choose as their, I can only think of a derogatory term at this point, who they will choose to be their their host.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way. Um, and I've had these participants describe to me that they were in the midst of this ayahuasca ceremony, and suddenly they saw an entity come into the center of the circle. And this entity would come up, would one by one, would come and look into the face of each participant, and then boom, would go inside of one.
As all these things become uncovered, I want to wrap up with some of the bigger kind of questions in terms of disclosure with ETs and stuff. I mean, I know it's been, talked about in the conspiracy world. Oh, when's disclosure? When's disclosure? Well, in my opinion, it's happening. Like it's a slow rollout, but it seems like this past year, the news about things happening in space, discoveries, all this stuff have become very, very prominent. And also the Pope going around, which has that Vatican connection, making friends with everybody, even pulling the Protestant Church under its sort of jurisdiction or the big umbrella with the whole together concert over the summer. And it just seems like there is a concerted effort globally to prepare us for an announcement of some kind. And I mentioned in a previous video that by the time like a real big event happens, we may all be just completely conditioned to accept it, because we're all going to have our virtual reality goggles on, walking around not really knowing what's real, what's not real anymore. So if these things manifest and it's pretty supernatural, the world might be like, oh yeah, cool, we've been interacting with these virtual aliens forever or whatever. I don't know. But what are your thoughts here in terms of the bigger, I guess, the timelines and the bigger concepts of what you've uncovered, and in conjunction with what's being, unveiled in our time now?
Well, let me preface my thoughts by saying this. I believe that we are in a season of grace right now. I believe that there are many, many voices that are and have been preparing people for what the real issue is that's looming on the horizon. And the operative word is deception. That's what's coming our way. Deception, the likes of which the world has never seen, ever before seen. That's what's coming.
Right.
And that deception is at some point in time going to be unleashed. And when it is unleashed, it's not just a lie. This deception is not just a lie. I want people to understand that deception is a power. It's potent. It is a poison. It isn't just an untruth. So the preparation, the preparation of one's heart and mind against deception is not simply having a set of facts at your disposal that you memorize, that you become aware of. It is a spiritual preparation and a mental preparation that happens by the grace of God. And it's something that, as believers, it's something that it's a work that the Holy Spirit, which is called the Spirit of Truth, does in us. And so we are in a time of preparation right now, in my opinion, for the deception that is looming on the horizon. And those who are preparing, and when I say preparing, I don't mean that are just familiarizing themselves with information or are prepping in some kind of a physical sense with food and water. I mean, there's a saturation that happens in your heart and in your mind. You have not only become aware of something, but there's something happening on a deep spiritual level that is laying the foundation in your heart and in your mind to be able to resist the power of deception, not just the falsehoods, not just the lies, but the power of deception.
Yeah.
And it is a power. It is intoxicating.
Yeah.
And so it's a deadly serious thing. And it's looming on the horizon. In my opinion, and to the best of my knowledge, it will have to do with the revelation, the disclosure of non-human sentience on one level or another that are directly involved in society, that may have an ancient component in terms of human history. It may have a genetic component. I want people to understand that today, what is the date today? Today is September the 28th of 2016. That today we have already breached the beginning of the genetic revolution, of what scientists are already calling the hybrid age.
Yep.
Because this past week, I believe this past week, definitely in the last month, the first publicly disclosed child with 3 parents was born. We have crossed the Rubicon into the genetic age, and we have to understand that there are serious implications that are associated with that reality. Serious implications. Remember the Industrial Revolution, that when mankind reached the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, when it happened, when the Industrial Revolution happened, and basically we entered into the machine age,
Right.
the world changed drastically in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
The genetic revolution will have the same impact on humanity.
Yeah.
But instead of revolutionizing the industrial world, the genetic revolution will revolutionize what it means to be a human being.
Yep.
And will have widespread, far-reaching implications for every last human being on the face of the planet.
Yeah.
Designer babies is just the beginning.
Yeah.
We're already creating children with 3 parents. It's been legalized. We did it in Mexico. It hasn't been legalized in the United States, but it's already been legalized in Great Britain. It can now happen in the United Kingdom, legally. So that is again, we have crossed the Rubicon. You and I know that genetic experimentation and cloning has already been happening for many years under the ground. In some confidential programs that are funded through the black budget happening in the deep underground military bases. I absolutely believe that is the case, but it's different when these things reach the public venue, because there is something called, that people need to be aware of, there's something called the inevitability thesis, which is also referred to as the technological imperative. And what the inevitability thesis, the technological imperative, posits is that once a technology is introduced into society, what follows inevitably is the development of that technology. And this principle is even more dynamic in a military context. So we know that logic dictates in a military context that if you can develop a weapon that will give you the upper hand against an adversary, you will develop it to its maximum potential, period. It's not a question of it may be developed. It will be developed, period. In as much as it can be, it will be, especially if your adversary, China, is already developing technology associated with a particular military advantage. In other words, if the Chinese are developing super soldiers, you can be guaranteed that the United States military is also developing super soldiers. You don't have to ask or wonder if we are, know that we are.
Yeah.
Now, the same principle applies for those technologies that are introduced into society at large. Okay, we now know with unequivocally that we are cloning above ground. We're cloning above ground. We're growing babies in embryonic sacs outside of a mother's womb. We're doing that. We're growing human organs in pigs and in other animals. We are growing human embryos in animals publicly. These are things that have been publicly stated. Not only are we doing it in the United States, it's happening all over the world. Okay, we know that that is a fact. We have a baby that was birthed from 3 different parents in Mexico. We know that it's already been legalized to do that in the United Kingdom. Therefore, according to the inevitability thesis and according to the technological imperative, these technologies will be developed to their maximum potential. End of story. They will be developed to their maximum potential, regardless of the risks to human society. The atomic bomb followed the inevitability thesis to a T. The development of nuclear technology and nuclear plants, in spite of all the dangers, in spite of the fact that we could blow the planet up, that technology has been and is still being perfected, regardless of the detrimental implications and possibilities that they pose. All right? So the genetic revolution, the hybrid age has begun. Ladies and gentlemen, the days of Noah 2.0 has begun. We are living in the beginning of a repeat of the days of Noah. Whether or not you believe that that's what Jesus meant when he said, as in the days of Noah, is irrelevant. It makes no difference.
Yeah, it's here. It's here.
If you believe that that's what Jesus meant or not.
Yeah.
It's happening. And therefore, I think it's safe to assume that our Savior knew and understood the times in which we would be living, at the very least, the last generation of whom he was speaking in Matthew 24, that there would be a genetic revolution, that there would be another hybrid age. So when he chose to say, as in the days of Noah, he knew what that implied.
Yeah.
For that final generation that will be living on the earth.
Yeah.
We are living in the days of Noah 2.0. It has begun. It is irreversible. It is inevitable. It will happen and has already begun. So in the midst of all of these political contentions, in the midst of all the geopolitical things that dominate the news, we have to keep our eyes on the genetic revolution that has begun, and it will move swiftly. And the foundation of it was laid during the Human Genome Project, at the completion of the Human Genome Project, where we effectively mapped the book of life in terms of our genetic code. Yeah. We've been making vast advancements underground, out of sight, out of mind. I believe we can fully clone a human being and have been doing so. And by the way, think of all the implications involved in that. There could be a slave generation that was cloned under the ground, never sees the light of day, nobody could ever know about it. That is just a generation of human beings that were cloned or bred or genetically engineered to be slaves, living beneath our feet. Is it happening for sure? I don't know, but I can tell you this: the potential is there, the possibility exists. Knowing the nature knowing the wickedness of human nature, of sinful nature, it would not surprise me if something like that has been perpetrated.
Well, I mean, you talked about power being the central theme of deception, and if the power is there to be wielded, humanity has never stopped. They've never been shy of taking that up, and that's that principle you were talking about.
It is inevitable.
The inevitability, the theory, it's so prevalent now, and I think people, one of the things that I mentioned to people about the whole election cycle and everything else, it's like, great, yeah, we're discussing these things, but nobody's discussing, especially in politics, the real issues of technological changes, the genetic changes you discuss. I've pointed out the fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the Davos stuff, they're really telling us what they're doing. Mining space, we're going to intermingle everything, and it ties back to the 2030 UN agenda. There is a concerted effort by the United Nations, which obviously has its connection to the Pope and the Vatican, which goes into all this underground networking that you're starting to uncover through your films and everything. There is a concerted effort to move things in a certain direction by the year 2030. They want to externalize these technologies that do change our genetics. They also, put us in the system, the global beast system. I mentioned, I think there's a video that's not published yet, but it'll come after this one. I say how you can't read Revelation 13, about the image of the beast and the mark of the beast. Our generation, there's no way to ignore the technological influence that shapes those prophecies and makes them more plausible than ever. Our generation's reading them. I read it and it's like, wow, this is clearly talking about things that can only happen in our generation, in our time, where technology has advanced to a certain level and is at a place where it is disseminated enough and the infrastructure is built enough to deploy these elements that will not just enslave. It's not just enslavement, it's complete loss of your human identity to the point where you're abandoning the image of God that you're created in replacement of the image of the beast, and that's why you have to worship it and all this stuff. You're giving up your humanity, and that's what Satan wants, and that's why anyone who takes the mark or worships the image, they're unredeemable. They have given up their humanity. They've given up their chances to, have the blood of Jesus cover them. Because
they're no longer candidates for salvation.
Exactly. And so it's a serious issue that ties right back to the importance of the gospel. And this is what's so kind of exciting but alarming at the same time, is that this world that the world of science, or whatever, materialistic whatever, and this really hyper spiritual, in the Bible and Christianity, religion, all this stuff. In the public, it's this, this thing that can't fuse together or can't cooperate. But it seems like when we look at it from this prophetic perspective, the remnant church, maybe we might be the only ones that are looking at it going, oh my gosh, there is a huge overlap. The Bible prophecy, the prophetic angle that puts everything into proper perspective of where we are, it's quite remarkable. And, I always encourage people to just hold on to the word, because things are happening real fast. I think, the infrastructure for the fourth industrial revolution, as they call it, is happening. They're going to start building railroads. The robots are going to start showing up everywhere. I mean, it's going to get really bizarre in the next 10, 15 years. By 2030, they want pretty much everybody on microchips, at the very least, to be identified in a huge database system. Period. That's in their documentation.
And the ultimate goal is post-humanism.
Yeah.
It is, I like to call it the Cain and Abel effect, but we won't get into that. But it is a usurpation of human authority.
Right.
It is the willful abdication of humanity, abdicating the very genetic markers that give them authority as human beings, the genetic markers specifically that make them human. And it is a coup of the authority of this planet. And it is beginning. The end game is post-humanism. What we're entering now is transhumanism. It's the beginning of the beginning. This could take 100 years to unfold, or it could unfold in 20 years. I don't know. It all depends on certain factors, disclosure being one of those factors. There are more genetic defects in the human genome than in any other than in the genome of any other creature. By far, more defects in the human genome. Many of our diseases are the result of defective genes. We know that cancer in almost every case, is a result of defective genes. Right now, we're already developing procedures that involve taking snippets of DNA, certain genes, out of individuals whose genomes do not have those cancer-prone genes, those defective genes, and are inserting those genes, replacing the defective genes with non-defective genes, human-to-human gene splicing.
Yeah.
What happens when we realize that we can make some dramatic improvements to the human genome by splicing in the genes from non-human creatures?
Yeah.
And in essence, upgrade our genome and maybe even reactivate those latent genes, those deactivated genes inside of the human genome. This isn't science fiction. This is happening now. Genetics is the future of the future that my children are going to live in, is the genetic age. The hybrid age is what they call it, the hybrid age. In fact, this child that was born recently of 3 parents is being called a hybrid baby. So in a sense, what happened, I'm 33 years old. What happened, by the time I turned 33, we created a hybrid baby publicly and are celebrating the creation, the marvel of a hybrid child.
Right.
So what's going to happen when my child is 33 years old?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're absolutely going to have robots on the scene. That is unequivocal. We will absolutely have nanobots running in our bloodstreams.
Yep.
We will absolutely have hybrids of all kinds walking around the earth. We will absolutely have individuals with upgrades, chips that have been integrated into the cerebral cortex, which are going to give them the ability to store data that can be retrieved whenever they need it, using their minds. How are your children going to compete with those cyborgs at a university level? They won't. See, there's a class divide that's coming, and the sooner that we understand what's coming, and the sooner we can prepare the next generation for this. And that is, there's a class divide.
Yep.
There are going to be the enhanced humans and the unenhanced humans. I refer to them as the neo-humans, the new humans, and the neo-humans, the Neanderthalic humans, those humans who willfully choose to be outdated, outmoded, and those humans who willfully choose to enhance, the neo-humans. What do you think is going to happen in that class divide? How do you think the neo-humans are going to view the neo-humans, as I refer to them, the Neanderthals, the willful Neanderthals, as will be viewed, right, and our children who choose not to enhance, who choose not to hybridize? Those people who choose not to hybridize are going to be, or to not to cybridize or hybridize, are going to be viewed as inferior,
Absolutely.
as religious kooks, as what's the word for people who are afraid of technology? I forget the word that defines those peoples. I mean, those.
Luddite.
Exactly, Luddites. These inferior, stupid Neanderthalic Luddites are going to be seen as a drag on society. So you can expect a purge in the future, because these idiots, these Neanderthalic, in many cases, Christian idiots, as they'll be viewed, are dragging the rest of society, are holding the rest of society back, that if society would just abort this group of fundamentalists, and it's not just going to be Christians, it'll be lots of different categories of people who will say, for one reason or another, no, we don't want to enhance. Right. This group is going to be aborted. And if anybody reads the work of Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was one of the, she's very advanced in years at this point, but was one of the mothers, the guiding spirits behind this transhuman and post-human paradigm that's coming, she channels an entity in one of her books. I forget what she calls the entity. I believe she calls it the Christ essence or something some abased term like that, some bastardized Christian term. And this entity speaking through her declares that there are going to be defective seeds that are not going to want to evolve.
Right.
It's about co-creation, and that we are going to consciously evolve. And the defective seeds that do not want to consciously evolve, that resist the conscious evolution of our species, when these technologies come to maturity, and they will, remember the inevitability thesis,
Right.
the technological imperative, they will mature. These technologies, the nanotechnology, genetics, the cybernization, all of these technologies are going to mature to the point to where human beings will be able to consciously evolve. It is an end around the gospel. The human condition, the condition that we have of sin and death, the degradation of our species, the devolution of our genome, was caused by sin, was caused by insubordination against God. The end around the gospel of Jesus Christ, which calls for repentance, which demands that one repent and receive the free gift of God in his Son, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross as a man to rectify Adam, us,
Right.
to become the second Adam, to rectify us so that when we die, we could live in his immortal condition. The end around the rejection of the gospel and the end around the gospel in the minds of the Luciferian elite is conscious evolution.
Yeah.
Is to use technology and knowledge, the knowledge of the Watchers, by the way, to remedy death
Yep.
and the human condition.
Yeah, it's the same. It's really, and this has been thematic, and this is a really hard point that I wanted to make on Age of Deceit too, is that the promise of the occultists, the Luciferians that have been at this thing of immortality, even in certain terms, describing it as bringing us back to the state of Eden, this restoration process. Yeah, we all see it. God gave us his own son to rectify it. Yet the Luciferians, oh shoot, hold on. Okay. Yet we have, the Luciferians who want it on their own terms, and technology being that vehicle, because, and I show this in my film, but the first use of technology in the fallen sense is really interesting when you look at it biblically. If you see the definition of technology, it's a useful tool that guides, it helps solve a problem, right? As soon as Adam and Eve fell, they felt shame. They had a problem. So what do? They cut fig leaves to cover themselves. That's technology. That's the beginning of technology being a supplement to try to fix the problem of the fall.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That tradition has gone on for ages, since the beginning really of man, or the fall of man at least. And there's a metaphor there in that Genesis, I think it's Genesis 3, where it talks about that, where God later gives them coats of skin, right? To kind of show like, hey, you guys tried your way with the fig leaves, that's great, but I'm going to give you coats of skin, saying like, hey, I'm the one to restore this for you. It's a really interesting metaphor that I think is embedded in the scriptures in the beginning chapters of Genesis, and we're seeing that play out now, and we can understand those scriptures in this really unique way in this time. And a concept has been there. The New Age has really been the vehicle to push this human evolution concept in a sort of spiritual way. Then the technology is catching up. Technology is using religious terminology. We will live forever. We will defeat death. We will blah, blah, blah. These are all
It's an ancient concept.
Yeah,
it is an ancient concept. You
verbiage.
shall be as gods.
Yep.
It goes all the way back to the mother of our race, Eve. You shall be as gods. And the truth is that that's what the gospel of Jesus Christ does. He restores us to what we were supposed to be, and then we rule and reign with him, with the King. That's what the gospel does through a legit, and that's God's restoration, plan of restoration. The amazing truth of the gospel, the unfolding of the mystery of the gospel. But yet the Luciferians reject Christ, but are aiming for the same end. They want back into the Garden of Eden. But they're following Lucifer, who promises that they will apotheosize.
Right.
They will become gods, and they will do it through knowledge.
Right.
And they will do it through intercourse with the rebel entities that betrayed God long ago.
Right.
And in their minds, by resurrecting these rebel entities, resurrecting the golden age, and ushering in basically the kingdom of Lucifer. They believe that, and I believe that they, in their hubris and in their folly, actually believe that they can develop weapons of war, and I believe this is part of what CERN is all about, to go to war with angels and angelic beings.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so they're not only planning to apotheosize, they want to dethrone the Son of God, or at least usurp his throne, the throne that belongs to him. Remember, who is worthy to break the seals? Who is worthy to take the scroll and basically occupy the throne of David? Nobody was found in heaven and on earth. And there was bitter weeping in heaven until one was found worthy, the Lamb who was slain, the Son of God. Only he is worthy to occupy that throne. But there will be one last insurrection to try and usurp that throne. And that is literally, we are entering into the final stages of that insurrection. And it will not be a mere insurrection of human beings. This is the final insurrection of the enemies of the King of Kings. And those enemies include a host of non-human entities, ranging from what we would describe as angelic entities to hybrids. What we might describe as ethereal creatures to very material, corporeal creatures that are already interacting with the human race, that are residing both under the ground and, I believe, far above it. And all of these things are beginning to converge and are creating a very intricate tapestry that is the deception that is coming and the great war that is coming. Yeah. And interdimensional galactic level war that is coming. And we are slipping into the final stages of the whole thing. The age is winding down to a conclusion. Yeah. And it will be a very bloody and violent conclusion. But thank God that the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords triumphs at the end of this great battle. And that's literally what we're entering into. So again, the end goal, the end game is post-humanism, to move humanity, to seduce humanity out of their birthright with a bowl of soup.
Pretty much, yeah.
And that's and by the way, it is important to understand the birthright of being human. There is a birthright that comes along with being a human being, yeah. Regardless of whether or not you're a believer, regardless of whether or not you are righteous or unrighteous. The fact that you are human gives you a sphere of dominion that is enforced by God. Yeah.
Yeah, I always often say, if you reject the gospel, you're actually rejecting your own humanity. Because
you're rejecting the redemption of what you were created to be, the restitution, the restoration of what it means to be human. So here's the difference, guys, because you nailed it. The gospel says, be restored to human. Be restored to the level of humanity that you were created to be. Transhumanism, posthumanism, Luciferianism says, forget about your humanity. Evolve into something more.
Right.
It's the restoration of the human race on one side, and it is the forfeiture of humanity to become something more than human on the other.
Right.
And that is the war. That is the battle that our children, if not us, our children are going to be living in the midst of humanity 2.0.